Boys kissing. Yeah, that's it. We're going to talk about the boys' love genre, from its historical influences, the genre's conception, and all the ways that BL has evolved into the diverse genre that it is today. From tragic explorations of doomed love and abuse to the more lighthearted, comedic explorations of two people coexisting. Just like with Yuri, I love learning about the history of things that I'm interested in and having any excuse to talk about shoujo manga from the 1970s. So, let's start off with a little bit of etymology. There are many ways we can refer to the genre of boys loving boys, and while they all mean the same thing to some, they do have a little bit of differences. Boys love, or BL, has been a sort of catch-all term for a while, first used in 1991 by the magazine Image as a catch-all term for male-male romance. BL is the common term used to market this media in Japan and has become more common in English-speaking fan spaces as well. At least online, and also at conventions. Yaoi, the other common term used for this genre, was coined in the late 70s by doujin artists. Doujins basically being self-published manga, typically fan works, but not always. It's a term created from the phrase yamanashi, ojinashi, iminashi, which means no climax, no point, no meaning. A self-deprecating, ironic term referring to how some early yaoi works typically focused on intimacy and would be lacking in plot or character development. This was initially used to describe amateur works that were inspired by shonen-ai and gay manga. But if you've been online since like the 2000s and 2010s in BL spaces, that was the term predominantly used to describe this genre, at least in English-speaking spaces. Shonen-ai is a semi-common term used for this genre and is the literal Japanese of boys' love. Historically, it was used in the same context of shoujo-ai, meaning it was used to describe relationships between a grown adult man and a younger, usually adolescent boy. However, in the 1970s, it was used to describe a new genre of shoujo manga that featured romance between bishonen, or beautiful, androgynous, or effeminate boys. One thing that's usually associated with shonen-ai specifically is references to literature, history, science, and philosophy that created stories that were challenging to younger readers, and stories that grew with the reader, becoming more clear the older and more educated one got. I say this as someone who loves this kind of thing and not in an anti-intellectual way, partially as a joke. Shonen-ai is the pretentious BL. In English-speaking fan spaces, shonen-ai took on a connotation of being more safe for work than yaoi, which gained the connotation of being more explicit. BL, yaoi, and shonen-ai are the main terms used, but there is one more that holds historical significance. Tanbi is a term that predates the BL genre of manga and anime. It was used to describe erotic literary fiction about male-male relationships. Notable authors would be Yuki Mishima, Junichiro Tanizaki, and Yasunari Kawabata. By the 1980s, magazines aimed at BL fans were using the term tanbi to describe fiction by amateur and professional writers in those magazines. This term was also used for literature with themes of homoeroticism and implied homosexuality. This would include works by authors like Oscar Wilde, Jean Cocteau, and Tatsuhiko Shibusawa. Tanbi is primarily used to describe regular fiction literature, but has also been used for manga. It is important to note here that yaoi and BL does not include bara, or gay manga written by and for gay men. That's its own thing with its own history. So now that we've defined the terms and made a distinction, how did we get to this big subculture of girls, theys, and gays reading about androgynous men being in love? Big shocker, BL did not create the concept of homosexuality and androgyny. Japan has a history with androgyny and homosexuality amongst men. Gay people have always existed, but also, y'all know how people used to say Greece was really gay, like ancient Greece? When in reality it was just grown men taking advantage of younger boys they held power over? It was like that in pre-Meiji Japan as well. From monasteries, samurai circles, and kabuki theaters, it was apparently common for adult male mentor figures to enter relationships with their adolescent mentorees. These kinds of relationships were also depicted in art and literature with works like The Tale of Genji, said to be written by Murasaki Shikibu and possibly her daughter in the 11th century. Or 1687's The Great Mirror of Male Love by Ihara Saikaku, which is where this history ties into this video. This sort of dynamic shows up a lot in taboo romances, student-teacher, weird age gaps, and it shows up quite a bit in BL. It was very prevalent in like the 90s and the 2000s, although that is true for just shoujo at large. Shoujo in general was like wild and problematic in the 90s and 2000s, or at least like the well-known memorable titles. However, during the Meiji era, Japan was going through westernization and culturally became a lot less tolerant of homosexuality and implemented laws that would target homosexuality. But this didn't stop people from being gay, it never has. Nor did it stop people from writing about homosexuality. There's not really a male equivalent to Class S relationships that served as the foundations of Yuri. Instead, we saw creators turning to subtext in order to still tell stories about male homosexuality in a culture that was shifting away from their quote-unquote tolerance. And throughout the 1900s, we began to see the ingredients of modern BL come into place. Kasho Takabatake's illustrations in the shonen magazine Nihon Shonen pretty much created what would become B-shonen. Beautiful boys, often in homosocial or homoerotic contexts that are feminine. 1961, Mari Mori, a Tanbi author, publishes her novella A Lover's Forest, the first in a trilogy that explores the doomed relationships between older men and younger boys. A Lover's Forest, in particular, follows the relationship between a professor and a younger working boy. Her works were somewhat reminiscent of the age gaps found in pre-Meiji Japan that we talked about just a bit ago, although the same power dynamic of official mentoree and mentor seemed to be less present. I've not actually read her writing, this is just based off of what I've been able to read about her writing. So the dynamic might still be there, I don't know. I'm not fluent in Japanese. A Lover's Forest is cited as a major influence to shonen-ai. Mari Mori's works were influenced by European literature, with heavy Gothic-lit influence, and you could say the same for many shonen-ai stories. She also laid the foundation for a lot of common tropes. Some are more typical of earlier shonen-ai, like Western settings, educated characters, significant age gaps, and fanciful or surreal vibes. Tropes found in A Lover's Forest that have continued to be common in BL beyond early shonen-ai are really pretty men, seme-uke dynamics, with the top being more aggressive and the bottom being more passive and also more feminine compared to the masculine seme character, but still masculine enough to be attractive as a man to female readers. Also, the seme character is rich. I didn't write this in the script, but for people who don't know, seme is basically the top and uke is basically the bottom. I don't think I can explain any further on YouTube. I do have a lot of thoughts on the whole seme-uke thing, the heteronormativity of it, the way that it's portrayed in some BL, not all, but a lot of the ones that kind of became infamous, or the ones that like people talked about a lot, at least in the 2000s and 2010s, and the way those tropes were utilized, it was giving man and woman with the uke, the one being penetrated, being the one that had more feminine traits, becoming a stand-in for the youthful woman in the relationship. And again, not all BL stories are as heavy-handed with this dynamic, but it is a trope and a stereotype of the genre. Anyway, manga in general was also experiencing changes that set the stage for shonen-ai, with Gekiga underground comics geared towards adults with a more realistic art style emerging in the 1950s, introducing more mature themes and serious stories to the medium, and in turn, influencing more mainstream manga, paving the way for tough topics and human relationships to be depicted in professionally published manga. On the shoujo manga front, Hideko Mizuno's series Fire, which ran from 1969 to 1971, was special for having a male protagonist. Y'all ever notice how media targeted towards one demographic, especially a younger demographic, will usually have their main characters be a part of that demographic, or at the very least, the gender that you are aiming for in marketing? A lot of shoujo manga, even now, will feature female protagonists, usually teenagers, high schoolers, things like that, which is not a bad thing. God knows we don't get enough well-written female characters in media unless it's being made for girls. But shoujo manga tended to focus on girls, since it was for girls. Having a male protagonist was different, and a requirement for boys' love to be boys' love. Fire follows an American teenager, Aaron, who, after going to juvenile prison, turns to music and eventually starts a band. I've not read this manga, but I've heard it also explored sexuality with Aaron and the homosexuality in American rock culture. And despite being different, Fire seemed to be pretty popular when it was publishing, and I'd say did contribute to the changes in shoujo manga we began to see with mangaka that are considered a part of the Year 24 group. All of this takes us to the 1970s, where shoujo manga artists were making big changes in the shoujo demographic that has gone and shaped much of the manga industry and also me as a person. Boys' love as a manga genre started and has stayed mostly within shoujo and josei, manga for girls and adult women. We see BL tropes used for characters like Gojo and Geto in Jujutsu Kaisen, but for the most part, BL is marketed towards girls and women, published in shoujo and josei magazines, and when it comes to shonen works, the assumption is that many of the fans of these male-male pairings that may utilize BL tropes are also women. That's the assumption. I'm not saying all Gojo Geto's shippers out there are girlies. But that is the assumption with how it gets talked about. All of this is largely in part to shoujo manga having a bit of a revolution. During the 1970s, manga artists publishing shoujo manga began to push the boundaries. Gone were the days of simplistic stories written for a very young audience, and shoujo being nothing more than a stepping stone for a male manga artist seeking to move up to the grander, bigger, better shonen. We were getting stories with more complex and mature themes, stories that explored politics, gender, sexuality, and tragedy. Sometimes all of that in one go. This revolution in shoujo is largely credited to a group of manga artists that have retroactively been called the Year 24 group by critics, academics, and freaks like me who love learning and talking about 70s shoujo manga. It's kind of a special interest of mine. And two members of this unofficial group are responsible for not only changing my brain chemistry as a teenager, but also creating the BL genre, more specifically the shonen-ai sector. Let me introduce y'all to Keiko Takemiya and Moto Hagio. Our shonen-ai story starts with two short works that would later be turned into longer series depicting doomed love between schoolboys in European boarding schools. But before we get into the specifics, I do think it's worth noting that both Moto Hagio and Keiko Takemiya were not only friends, but influenced by some of the same things. European works like the films This Special Friendship and Death in Venice. This Special Friendship specifically involves two schoolboys in love, but after being found out by a teacher, the older boy eventually rejects the younger boy. The rejected boy commits suicide. Yeah, that's basically the Heart of Thomas's starting premise, more or less. Death in Venice, and more specifically the actor, Jorn Anderson, served as a blueprint for B-shonen. Beautiful boys, and in some stories, the way those beautiful boys are exploited. Jorn Anderson was listed specifically as inspiration for characters like Gilbert from Kazetsuki no Uta. Keiko Takemiya debuted as a professional manga artist in 1967, while shoujo was still heavily restricted. But the funny thing about manga censorship is that the way laws were written, it was very explicit and specific in saying, hey, you cannot have sex between a man and a woman, sure. But also, that kind of creates a legal loophole here for gay people. It's said that Takemiya wanted to write a story that explored sexuality and was explicit, so she turned to male-male romance, as that loophole. Male-male romance was also something she thought readers would be more interested in, since female and male relationships may be too real. And there's topics like marriage and pregnancy that would be brought up. If the romance was between two boys, readers could ignore all of the real-world issues and just focus on the love, the story being told here, not the logistics that would be in their own relationships, whether now or in the future. This thought process is part of what sets early boys' love aside from stories that seek to actually depict gay men in a realistic manner. Boys' love is gay men as a form of escapism for the assumed female reader. Let's put a pin on this point for later, though. Keiko Takemiya came up with the idea for Kazetoki no Uta and wrote up a detailed outline in 1970, and even drew up 50 pages of the manga in January of 71. However, Kazetoki no Uta is controversial. It's problematic yaoi, and also a girl's story with no girls in it? Wild. But all hope was not lost for the controversial manga. Keiko Takemiya was able to write and publish a condensed version in December of 1970 in Beisatsu Shoujo comic as Yuki to Hoshi to Tenshi to. But upon re-release, it was renamed to Sunroom Night, or in English, In the Sunroom. BL, or shonen-ai, wasn't really a thing yet, so it was marketed as a story about beautiful boys, or bishonen. This will become a huge archetype for shonen-ai. Sunroom Night, while it is about two boys falling in love, there's also a female character in the main ensemble, which is not very typical of BL. However, Takemiya was able to use this female character as a tool to appear like there might have been a love triangle between the two boys and a girl, making it easier to tell the story of two boys in love, kind of. Actually, while Kazetoki no Uta certainly was not happening right now, Sunroom Night also almost didn't happen as well. Boys kissing is controversial to cowards. Also, nudity is a thing that is controversial, which Sunroom Night contains. But as someone who has read it, it's really not that serious. Manga standards have really changed. So when it came time for Keiko Takemiya to write a short one-shot for Beisatsu Shoujo comic, she initially had one thing, but at the very last minute, submitted Sunroom Night under the old project's title that had already been announced. Same name, totally different story content. She did this swap up at the last minute, knowing her story would have been rejected if there was time to revise it. However, with no time to do anything different, the first shonen-ai manga was published, and I'm sure she had consequences. The narrative structure of Sunroom Night is relatively the same as Kazetoki no Uta, but all the specifics are different, and expanded upon in Kaze. A girl loved tragedy back then, let me tell you. And many of Takemiya's stories were framed by a starting and ending monologue of one member of the couple mourning the other. But that's enough about Sunroom Night. We'll return to Keiko Takemiya when it's time for Kazetoki no Uta to be published. Moto Hagio was cooking in the 70s as well. Moto Hagio debuted as a professional manga artist in 1969. She's well known for her works like The Poe Clan, a vampire fantasy, and They Were 11, a sci-fi thriller. Her works were among the first shoujo manga to achieve commercial success in the mainstream, and she is a central figure of the Year 24 group. But amongst her great and acclaimed works, The Heart of Thomas sits there, as a grandfather of BL. The Heart of Thomas, much like Kazetoki no Uta, was an idea first that had public life as a different, shorter story, The November Gymnasium, an earlier draft that would become The Heart of Thomas. Moto Hagio began crafting up a narrative she didn't entirely expect to actually get published, taking the format of this special's friendship and flipping it on its head, starting her story with the premise of the other's ending. In August of 1971, another mangaka who's considered a part of the Year 24 group published Birth, a story about teen pregnancy. This was a marker in just how far shoujo manga was coming in its maturity, and suddenly, The Heart of Thomas didn't seem all that impossible to publish. Moto Hagio tried making The Heart of Thomas more in place with shoujo manga at the time, so an earlier draft was written with an all-female cast. Since shoujo was for the girls, it seemed to make sense not to center the story around boys. But this did not work out for her story. Writing girls as a woman for girls, Moto Hagio found herself trying to make things as realistic as possible, and for the Heart of Thomas to work, the characters needed to feel more separated from the intended audience. After moving from a more conservative shoujo manga, Nakayoshi, to a newer shoujo magazine, Shukan Shoujo Comic, in 1971, Moto Hagio began working with the editor Junya Yamamoto, who also seemed to work with many of the Year 24 group. Yamamoto seemed to be a very encouraging editor, not restricting what Moto Hagio could write. So when it came time for her to come up with something new, she gave The Heart of Thomas a test run in the form of November Gymnasium. She got to utilize her all-male cast telling a story about boys in love. It was a different story than what The Heart of Thomas would be, but the themes were similar. And of course, the setting and characters were the same. The November Gymnasium was published in November of 1971, but the short story was not enough. It was well received, but The Heart of Thomas needed more than a measly 40 pages to breathe. Shoujo manga was still predominantly shorter stories at this time. There was no skip beat, no vampire night, so a longer series would be less likely to happen. But Moto Hagio continued to make strides in the manga world, and so did shoujo manga. The Rose of Versailles, a longer for the time shoujo series by Ryoko Akita, proved to be very successful, and Moto Hagio was given the green light to compete with it. The Heart of Thomas would be the idea that got to come up to the stage of queer, longer-running historical shoujo manga. However, The Heart of Thomas was not super popular at first, and was initially ordered to be cut short. Moto Hagio did continue to cook though. Eventually, the readers came around. Partially due to another risk the company was taking, manga volumes. And the sales of the Po Clan manga volumes led interest back into the magazine and Moto Hagio's other work, Thomas. And boy, am I glad she got to finish her work, because when I came across The Heart of Thomas at like 14 years old in an Otaku USA issue I borrowed from a friend back in like 2012, it really changed my brain chemistry. But The Heart of Thomas also helped change the chemistry of shoujo manga as a whole, and its style language. Yes, shoujo manga is a demographic, not a genre, but also, different demographics, especially in manga, create their own identities that are grander than any one genre through common stylistic choices and trends that many artists in one particular demographic utilize. Likely due to magazines being mostly demographics based, with genre mattering a tad bit less, and magazines tend to have somewhat of a cohesive style. It's all different artists, but once you're familiar enough with the kinds of styles and stories a magazine publishes, it becomes easier to recognize what things are part of the same magazine or maybe even a direct competitor. Moto Hagio sought to combine art influences from pre-World War II Japanese shoujo magazines and jojoga, or lyrical pictures. We see the characters in The Heart of Thomas commentate on what's going on around them or their internal monologues, instead of utilizing a separate narrator to express things outside of dialogue. We also see a deviation from standard boxes on a page panel format. We see different shapes, borderless panels, visual metaphor, and backgrounds that convey emotion instead of a literal backdrop. Things are getting a lot more poetic and artsy in shoujo, and it's Moto Hagio's fault. Love her. After the success of The Heart of Thomas, the artistic flair continued to spread across shoujo manga, and the not quite yet formed shonen-ai genre. After years of continuing to further her career, Keiko Takamiya had not given up on Kazetoki no Uta. She had gained enough standing through popular works like The Pharaoh's Tome, but she was ready to publish Kaze. She even included a preview of Kazetoki no Uta in the first volume of her series Sora ga Suki. With her previous commercial success, she could finally use her influence and her popularity to convince her publishers to let her publish Kazetoki no Uta in all of its controversial glory. It's important to note, Takamiya was very particular about Kaze. Editors were not sure about the opening scene, which is Gilbert in bed with an older student, and asked her to move things around, but she refused, which is probably part of why she had to wait until she was influential and popular enough to throw her weight around to get it published. Girl had a vision and wanted the opening page to reflect the story of Kazetsuki no Uta as a whole. A hypersexual boy who is abused and exploited. And, you know, that's, like, if I could only describe Kaze in one sentence, I think that's the biggest thing. Anyways, I do believe the success of The Heart of Thomas helped lay the groundwork for Kazetsuki no Uta to be published. Sure, Thomas could have been a one-of-a-kind manga, but the two did share similar themes, and both were queer tragedies. If The Heart of Thomas could do well, who's to say Kazetsuki no Uta wouldn't also find its flowers? This isn't to say the manga was published and went well without a hitch. Unlike The Heart of Thomas, Kazetsuki no Uta was a lot more explicit for its time, containing depictions of sexual intimacy and assault, more specifically with the main character Gilbert being hypersexual in the face of his trauma, compared to The Heart of Thomas's Julie being more shut off and upset in the way victims are assumed to be in the face of his own trauma. There's no right way to be a victim, but that doesn't stop people from trying to hold fictional characters and even real people to weird standards. Kazetsuki no Uta's depictions of sexual abuse is done in a way that labels the main victim, Gilbert, as the more passive and stereotypical feminine victim, while also maintaining a level of separation from the assumed female reader. There's this common idea that comes up of seeing sex and sexual violence between a man and a woman being too realistic. I'm not 100% certain what was meant by that, though. I don't know if it's like something that's lost in translation or just they mean something specific that I'm not picking up on. It could be taken as saying queer relationships are not real and are just a fantasy world for the reader, diminishing the thought of non-heterosexual relationships, and also feeding into the false assumption that boys and men aren't victims of these things as well. Or just a focus on the assumed female reader and how male-on-female sexual violence is a very real threat. In the US alone, studies have shown that 81% of women experience sexual harassment or assault. The statistics for Japan are reported as lower only when discussing sexual assault, and it's reported that 1/3 of women experience harassment in the workplace. It is worth noting for all of this that sexual harassment and assault go underreported for a variety of reasons. With all the statistics, media tropes, and personal anecdotes floating around, it feels safe to assume that women are hyper-aware of the threat of sexual violence. This is probably the thought process that manga artists like Keiko Takemiya had when talking about realism and sexuality in their manga. There's also the idea of pregnancy being a real cause for concern, and well, that just isn't present when both members of the relationship are boys, unless you're writing an impreg thing, which is a whole thing in and of itself. And then we just have to talk about the Omegaverse, which I'm not doing that today. That's a whole other video topic in and of itself. Unless told otherwise, I am going to give the benefit of the doubt in hoping that realism claims is just centering the assumed female reader and her relationship with sexuality and sexual violence. Because a lot of early shonen-ai, I say a lot, Kazetsuki no Uta and The Heart of Thomas both utilize assault as a theme and a trauma for their characters. This is something that does pop up a lot over the years in BL works for various different reasons, and is handled with various different levels of nuance. And sometimes it's just there for the fantasy, but that's a whole different discussion that's far past the scope of this video. Back to Kazetsuki no Uta, the manga was initially seen as The Heart of Thomas from Wish, but once the story was given a chance to fill out its roots, Kazetsuki no Uta became a beloved classic that was cited as inspiration for other notable anime and manga, like Revolutionary Girl Utena, and even Berserk. What a legacy. If y'all are interested in more of a narrative breakdown and look at both The Heart of Thomas and Kazetsuki no Uta, please let me know. I am itching for any excuse to talk at length about these series. But that is where we will leave things for this video because I've spent far too long on these two already. There is more to BL than sad, tragic 70s shoujo. Kazetsuki no Uta was credited with popularizing shonen-ai and helping establish the genre. The Heart of Thomas and Kazetsuki no Uta normalized boys being in love with each other, and established BL as a staple of shoujo manga. And the girlies were eating it up. We saw the first BL manga magazine, June, in 1978, with a second one, Alan, starting in 1980. There was a lot of shonen-ai to go around, which is wild compared to the slow sputter that Yuri saw during the 70s and even up into the 90s. And I only compare the two because in my brain, Yuri and YAOI are siblings. It's gay manga. Starting in 70s shoujo, like same birthplace, similar-ish. They're the same to me. They're not the same, but like they're siblings. During the 70s, while shonen-ai was becoming established as a genre in professionally published manga, self-published manga and fanworks were starting to form more of a community. Comiket, the doujinshi convention market, held its first ever event in 1975, and the boys, they were kissing. The way I said that made it sound like every boy at Comiket was kissing. No, I just mean there was BL doujin. That's all I meant by that. Most yaoi doujinshi were fanworks about musicians like David Bowie and Queen. The girlies were not afraid to write real person fanfic, and they were more explicit in nature compared to shonen-ai, likely inspired by the manga series Fire. We can also see the BL doujin circles grow and include fanworks of popular shonen series. This would be how manga group Clamp got their start in the industry. By the late 80s, doujinshis were booming. Well, more accurately, they were filling a niche that wasn't being fulfilled. Readers were growing tired of the fantastical European settings of early shonen-ai and yearned for something closer to home, like their favorite doujin about boys from Captain Tsubasa being in love. Yeah, Captain Tsubasa, and more specifically the pairing Kojiro Hyuga and Ken Wakashimazu, were like Japan's Kirk and Spock from Star Trek, if anyone knows anything about American fan culture. They're the same. The genre was also yearning to move past the tragic schoolboys, opting for older protagonists. Banana Fish, while set in the US, is still a pretty good example of the shift in BL manga that started to take place in the late 80s and the 90s. The artwork was more realistic compared to the fanciful styles of the 70s, and characters were older teens and young adults. The story, while still tragic, was more action-oriented. Some of these changes are absolutely chalked up to new artists entering the scene, but I have noticed there are still certain styles and art trends that artists across the board will adopt in certain niches. It's why you can tell Red River came out in the 90s, Vampire Knight came out in the 2000s, A Sign of Affection in 2019 going into the 2020s, and it's also probably why the art style changed in Gravitation. The 80s also brought boys kissing to anime. Like with Yuri, BL saw a boost in popularity after being aired on TV. The anime Patario, while not a BL, did contain the first male-male relationship in anime in the characters Bankuran and Mariak. Kazetsuki no Uta and other BL manga also saw OVAs in the late 80s. But outside of anime and manga, light novels exist and are a part of this ecosystem, and there were BL light novels. I No Kusabi ran through the late 80s and was published into a collected book in 1990, with anime adaptations in the mid-90s and even another one in 2012. The novel was notable for subverting the sime uke trope. I mentioned the trope like once earlier and we haven't talked about it much, but in my experience, that trope was everywhere. Everywhere in the 2000s and 2010s. Mostly early 2010s, I would say. I explained earlier that sime uke trope is just top or bottom, with the specific personality traits and physical attributes associated with each one. The sime is usually more aggressive, more masculine, larger, richer, also older, while the uke is typically younger, more passive or bratty, inexperienced, and feminine in both narrative role and design. And it had already been established as such a common trope that I No Kusabi wasn't like the other boys kissing boys, because these boys were both alphas. No omegas to be found here. I will say though, I know Kusavi was notable for being very explicit and not the usual angst and melodrama that had become expected of BL at the time. On the other hand, Zetsuai, which was apparently originally a Captain Tsubasa doujin, was a BL novel from 1989. It was one of the first BL works to go international, which is pretty neat. The series upheld common BL tropes like angst, violence, and very little like on-screen sex happening. I say on-screen, it's a book. Y'all know what I mean. You don't see, it's not explicit. It was very melodramatic, just like readers were growing to expect with BL. It may not have tried to reinvent the wheel, but Zetsuai was popular and helped to further establish BL as a genre with its own genre conventions, which is notable because around this time, BL wasn't really recognized as a genre outside of the genre itself. BL writers had set it aside, made a space for themselves, but were still not seen as legitimate by those outside of the community. So any popular works helped prove what already existed to those less willing to acknowledge it. Throughout the 90s, we continued to see popular works from the 80s get anime adaptations. The genre was booming. Between 1990 and 1995, there were around 30 different BL magazines created, with 1993's magazine BX Boy being the most influential, with series like Kizuna Bonds of Love, Don't Be Cruel, and The Night Beyond the Tri-Cornered Window being published under that brand throughout the years. BL was also moving away from its tragic roots. Manga artists like Moto Hagio were still writing stories about abuse and trauma, but the genre as a whole was starting to feel a lot more lighthearted with series like Gravitation. Gravitation was goofy, and a complete 180 from what BL had stereotypically been. The series also used fragmented panels to depict intimacy without being considered explicit instead of an innuendo or coded visuals that non-explicit BL had been depending on. But outside of dedicated BL spaces, we were seeing elements of BL make their way to mainstream series that would otherwise have nothing to do with BL. Many works by Clamp would fall into this, Tokyo Babylon and Cardcaptor Sakura being some of the more well-known examples. And I say BL elements instead of depictions of queer men because characters like Yukito are very feminized and placed in a soft box in a way that I would say is pretty typical of BL and fanfiction. There's no need to uwooify or woobify Yukito because the girlies at Clamp did that for us already. The 90s is also when we started seeing more of a debate on the morality of BL, with openly gay writer Masaki Sato criticizing the genre for being homophobic in how it handled gay men, and calling fans disgusting women who have a perverse interest in intimacy between gay men. This might be where BL fans self-identifying as Fujoshi or Fudanshi come from, because I do know the Fujoshi is just rotten girl. I didn't actually do the research to make that connection before recording this video. I'm just gonna throw that out there. I do think that this is an argument worth hearing, and definitely could be true for works that fall into the BL genre. But the counter-argument of BL being fictional entertainment for women that's not seeking to be realistic, but more so an escape from misogyny, I think is also something that holds merit and is worth looking at. This whole debate did lead to the formalization of BL studies, which sought to focus on the genre and the relationship between women and BL. In English-speaking spaces, there has also been a lot of discussion on how BL has been a part of many people's queer awakening, either letting them engage with queerness without tying themselves to it before they're ready to, in the case of lesbians or just like girlies who like girlies to any degree, or people exploring sexuality outside of their assigned gender at birth with trans and non-binary BL fans. Could just be my social circle, but everyone I know, like everyone I actually know that's a BL fan, is queer and or trans. That's not to say every BL fan is. There's just lots of reasons why people like BL, I guess. But this is a debate that's been held in many different forms over and over and over again, both in a more academic sense and in an online discourse sense, We're literally just reheating the nachos of these essays from Chosier magazine in the 90s. Anyway, it's really funny to me that we as humans keep having these same arguments on the ethics of boys kissing for an assumed female audience, and we'll probably continue to argue about it for the rest of time, with both sides having genuinely really good points. I don't think I've ever known anyone like this, but there was a stereotype of BL fans being like weird, cringy teenagers that would harass real-life gay men, calling them yaoi, and I don't want to say that never happened. I guarantee you there's at least one person that did that. But also, that doesn't speak for everybody that is into the genre. So, like, yeah, there are weirdos, but not everybody's a weirdo in that sense. Like, most of us are not harassing people, I would hope. As we moved into the 2000s, BL saw popularity worldwide, along with anime and manga in general becoming more popular. We do see this trend again in the early 2000s when people get into anime and BL for the first time through COVID lockdowns and TikTok. BL was so big in the US that in 2001, YAOI-con became a thing. I remember seeing videos of cosplay skits when I was a kid and thinking, wow, I want to go to YAOI-con. An important lore about me, I used to think I really liked BL when all I did was just read a handful of fan fictions for non-BL series, and I read The Heart of Thomas, and I guess also Loveless, but I wasn't classifying Loveless as a BL at the time. That was it. I didn't watch anything. I didn't read anything. I said, wow, I love BL without actually consuming any. Anyway, BL was going global, and the image of BL that many who claim to dislike the genre seem to be stuck with was fully realized in English-speaking spaces. There's a reason that BL discourse now tends to come to the conclusion of, oh, you've not read anything published within the last 10 years. Got it. In my mind, a classic 2000s BL would be Junjo Romantica. There's a slew of tropes that for a long time were synonymous with BL. The yaoi hands, the occasional size difference with the sime being the bigger one, love interests that were so passionate about their little guy that the police needed to be called. No, really. BL has always included abuse, assault, rape, because sometimes people want to tell stories about trauma. Sometimes people want to explore these darker things because it does happen. If not to you, then someone you know, or maybe it's just a really upsetting news story that you are struggling to process. It's all over the place, and fiction is a safe way to explore these themes and how it affects a person, and maybe even how you can overcome it. Both Kazetoki no Uta and The Heart of Thomas, the grandfathers of BL, use this trauma as an aspect of the narrative and character motivations. It's treated like an awful thing, a tragic backstory of sorts, but also sometimes these themes are included as part of a fantasy. Female desire has been historically controversial, to the point that sometimes it is less shameful and easier for a woman to indulge in a sexual fantasy if it's being done to her, and she doesn't play an active role in wanting it. Not to say all people who are into this sort of thing are battling the shame of just having desire. That's a whole thing I don't really know enough to really go into and explain. But some infamous BL works, hell, even just shoujo works in general, will depict a male romance interest that, for one reason or another, either borderline assaults or literally assaults the main character, who's also typically the more feminine one of the two. It's why BL has the reputation for being rapey, but it's by no means exclusive to BL. It's a romance trope in general, and a trope that was in quite a few shoujo manga of the 90s and 2000s, not just the ones about boys kissing boys. But one thing to note that I think kind of gives us some context in trying to understand, even in the more fantasy depictions of assault, the victim is never treated as gross or less than for having that happen to them. But instead, they are still loved and treated as innocent, which isn't always the case for real-life victims who are shunned and looked down on by society, and apparently Japanese society is, like, really bad about that. What I've read, I don't live there, I've never been there, I don't know. I feel in my bones that that's gotta be connected to why it's such a common trope. But the trope isn't as common as we make it out to be, if that makes sense. In 2012, only 13% of the BL manga available in English contained rape. However, this does only include things that were commercially available in English, so it's not a perfect measure. You know, I know, we all know that piracy exists, and that is how most of us get to read things before they are officially licensed, if they ever get licensed at all. By the 2010s, there were countless BL manga and many anime series that felt like staples of the anime and manga fan diet. Or maybe just staples of BL fans and people on Tumblr. Series like Number 6, Love Stage, 10 Count, Given, even Yuri on Ice were all well-known parts of the BL ecosystem. The big-name BL anime also seemed to clean up its act as we moved through the later 2010s into the 2020s, with titles like Sasaki and Miyano serving as a cute high school romance for those who wanted something more wholesome. And it is really cute. I've not read the manga, but the anime is super cute if you need like a feel-good high school romance. But there's still your fair share of darker themes and explicit content for those reading. It's kind of interesting to me because most of the BL anime that gets talked about these days or is being made these days seemed to be deemed more wholesome and chaste. That's not true for all, but the ones that seem to be the most popular and the most talked about generally fall into that category. But a lot of the webcomics that have been super popular and talked about a lot are the polar opposite. I don't have a point to make here, it's just an observation that I find funny. It's almost like there's two different BL communities based on if you read a lot or you watch a lot. And I just think that's so silly. BL, while controversial in some aspects, has remained incredibly popular and I'd say pretty mainstream in some cases. The genre has grown so large and so like plentiful that if I were to sit here and try to like list every BL ever made and how it has influenced the genre or upheld the status quo, I want to say that'd be impossible because there's way too many. Which is a good problem to have. There are still BL magazines and even whole publishers that specialize in localizing and publishing BL manga specifically in English. It is worth noting that throughout the 2010s and onward, BL was no longer just about Japanese media for fans. We started seeing Chinese web novels, Korean comics, Thai dramas, hell, we even have Minecraft YouTubers calling their roleplay yaoi. BL fans engage with media from across the globe, interacting with queer fiction or the seeming misogynyless fantasy of boys kissing boys. This could be a whole video on its own, but BL isn't actually free of misogyny. We reflect the world we live in back into our art, whether we realize it or not. Be it the shallow female side characters, the way some BL couples fall into heteronormativity, and the feminine partner is usually treated as a woman would be in all the good and bad ways that come with that sometimes. The way some fans belittle and diminish female characters who seemingly get in the way of the men. The way some narratives kill off their female side characters. Killing Stalking has a whole scandal in Korea about how misogynistic it is. It's a whole thing that I wanted to mention, so you know that I know BL is not perfect. But it has been a genre historically for women's expression and exploration of sexuality. And as imperfect as that may be, I do find it really interesting to sit with that fact and see how that has shaped the genre. It's also fun to see how depictions go from androgynous beings where gender isn't actually a big deal narratively, just the fact that it's a same-sex relationship, to depictions where that is obviously a man and how he's designed and written, and these are men in love. And I think it's great that men, women, non-binary folks, everyone across the board enjoys boys' love. Much like how everyone across the board can enjoy girls' love. BL may be more tied to a feminine demographic than GL, but that doesn't stop people looking to engage with stories about pretty men kissing. And also, when you are exploring romance through a queer lens, even if it is a queer lens as imperfect as BL can be at times, it's still presenting ideas and themes in a slightly different way and tropes in a slightly different way than a straight romance may be. So if you're a straight person that really likes to read queer fiction, You're just experiencing romance in a slightly different way. And I think that's great. It's like being queer and reading straight romance. Like, yeah, that's not gonna happen to me, but like it's kind of interesting to see how some people interact with romance, and it's just a different dynamic to a genre. The genre being romance. This video isn't meant to be a comprehensive list of everything to ever exist, just a look at the anime and manga genre as a whole and how it's evolved, and it's painfully obvious that I really love to yap about 70s shoujo manga. If you want more of a list of select titles from each decade, I did do a panel with a friend at MomoCon, and you can find that here. It's still not exhaustive, but there is more time spent on things other than 70s shoujo. Anyway, that's how we got here. Honestly, be honest with me, do you guys think Naruto and Sasuke would have kissed as a gag if it weren't for the culture of BL, both as professionally published genre and a huge market of fan-made works? Is the reason Sasuke and Naruto kiss, is that all Keiko Takamiya and Moto Hagio's fault? I'm sure if it wasn't them, something else would have come up. Also, I wrote that as a joke, and at the time I was like, yeah, because a lot of shonen series, there's like this underlying idea that fujoshi, girlies who love to see boys kissing, keep things popular by creating fan works. But that does kind of just like completely ignore the like actual history of like bara, and the fact that that's a really common homophobic joke. Of like, oh look, the two guys kissed, how funny, how embarrassing. That wasn't just in Naruto. I don't know if I'm keeping that whole thing in. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you also love learning about shoujo and just manga in general and talking about really, really old manga. I always enjoy talking about it. I'm hoping to make more videos kind of like this. I know I want to make one about the Year 24 group, and I said earlier I would be so down to make a video about the Heart of Thomas and another one about Kazutoki no Uta specifically, more so about their narratives than how they impacted a genre and a demographic. So if those are things you guys would be interested in, let me know. Anyway, I will see you guys in my next video, whatever that may be, and I hope you guys have a great rest of whatever time it is for you. Anyway, bye!